students for Science Under Stars. Welcome everybody. A quick announcement. If you park, as long as you park in this complex, in front of the gate or by the building, you're fine. We won't tow the car. The university won't tow the car. So if you park over there by the entomology collection, that's totally good as well. Okay, so for our October event, we have Allison Hutt, who is a fifth-year PhD candidate at the Department of Integrated Biology at UT Austin, and then she's going to tell us all about resurrection plants. Welcome, Allie.
Hello. I'm going to do a whole bunch of bits that are, Halloween today, so get ready for that. But yeah, thanks for coming to the talk. I'm really excited to tell you guys about resurrection plants. Okay, so we'll just start out with a little bit about me. So I'm a plant bio PhD student at UT. Also, sorry, can you guys hear me in the back? Am I talking into the microphone okay? With some thumbs up around? Awesome. Okay, love it. Thank you. Okay, so plant bio PhD student. My research interests are around like ecology, evolution, and genetics, so I apply those things to plants. And I've kind of always loved weird biology, so yeah, a little bit about my journey into science. Growing up, I actually was really obsessed with animals and collecting roly-poly bugs, and I loved like jellyfish and weird birds and all the like freaky weird deep sea animals and stuff like that. And then when I got to undergrad, I started working with plants, and I kind of cured my plant blindness and started being really fascinated by the diversity and different abilities that plants have. Did my undergrad at Indiana University. I moved to Austin in 2017 after I did an internship through the National Science Foundation here at UT, and then worked as a technician here at the field lab for a little bit. So people who did the tour know there's a ton of research that happens here. So I worked here for a little while, and then I got the opportunity to start a PhD working on Tripogonella spicata, which is the resurrection grass a lot of you guys got to check out over at the table there, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. So first of all, just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, we'll go through some scary plant honorable mentions because I couldn't really resist the opportunity to show you guys some other cool Halloween-y sorts of plants. And then we'll talk about what is a resurrection plant, and you kind of have a clue happening here. So this is Tripogonella spicata rehydrating. This is a time lapse of about 24 hours. So we'll talk about some ecology, some of the evolutionary origin story for these plants, and how are they managing to come back from the dead, quote unquote. And then I'll show you guys some local species you should be able to go and find next time you're out in that type of habitat, taking a hike. So okay, we're gonna start with a little game, all right? So you say, how well do you guys know your scary plants? So I'm gonna give you a slide like this, and then you guys can just kind of call out if you know what the plant is, and you can get bonus points. You have to keep track of your own points, but you'll get bonus points if you know like the species name, the Latin name for it. So to start off, does anybody know this plant? You can just call it out if you think you know it.
Audrey.
It's Audrey too. Thank you. Yes, that is Audrey too, from the Little Shop of Horrors. She's an icon. We love her. Okay, so you guys might be hard to stump. We're going to start easy, and I'm going to see if I can stump you guys. Okay, so what about this plant? Maybe a little bit of an inspo for Audrey too.
Venus flytrap.
Venus flytrap. Does anybody know the Latin name, the species name? No. Okay, so you're right. There's Venus flytrap. It's Dionea muscipula, which is hard to say, so it's all right. You know what I'm saying? Okay, cool. All right, what about this one? Anyone seen these before? Pitcher plant. Okay, this is going to be tough. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find you guys, but yep, so this is the tropical pitcher plant, Nepenthes. I like how creepy they look. I like when they have the little fang-looking things going on. Okay, cool. So here's one more.
Hi, okay, welcome back. So we had a little bit of technical difficulties with the live stream at Brackenridge Field Lab. So I am just going to re-record this talk starting from where the live stream cut out and left off, and I'll just adapt it to the computery version. So hi, and we'll just keep going. Okay, so the next scary plant that I wanted to show everybody is one of my favorite plants. And I do think that it is very alien, weird looking, maybe debatable if it's scary, but I think it's a little creepy. But this is the sundew or Drosera genus, a few different species here. And these are also carnivorous. I do have a little bit of a love for carnivorous plants, so I couldn't help myself but show you a few of my favorites. Um, but yeah, this did not stump anybody at Science Under the Stars. Our crowd knew exactly what this was, so pretty cool. My next attempt to stump the crowd was with this plant, which everyone knew was a corpse flower, or at least some people knew. And then actually someone came up to me after the talk and let me know that, because I had the species name, but they let me know that this one is Rafflesia arnoldii, and then this is actually a different species of corpse flower. So always open to be corrected, of course, when I get something wrong. Um, and yeah, I mean, pretty clear now to see. Anyway, I think the scariest thing about this plant isn't necessarily its looks, but is the fact that it smells like a dead body, basically, or like dead rotting flesh, and that is for the purpose of attracting its pollinators, which are flies. So what attracts flies, but death. So the corpse flower definitely makes the list of mentionable scary plants. Next on the list, I really thought I was going to get y'all with this one, but someone in the crowd did recognize this plant as doll's eye plant. It's also called white baneberry, Actea pachypoda. I had the displeasure of stumbling on this on a hike one time. This is the only reason I know it exists. And it really creeped me out. It creeped me out big time. And that is because these berries on the plant look a lot like eyeballs, or they are also, I believe, not edible. And I do wonder who figured that out because I cannot imagine looking at this and being desperate enough to eat one of those. But somebody was, and yeah, not a good lunch. Okay, next up, this one, incredibly creepy looking. Um, we have these weird little faces going on. Um, I did end up having to give a clue for this one, and so what these are the dried up seed pods of this flower, and then the clue did help out the audience, and someone did say the correct guess, which is snapdragon seed pods. So yeah, the snapdragon flower, some of them when they dry out end up looking like creepy little skulls. So very cool. Okay, last one is this, and um again, I think someone did recognize this as the Selaginella lepidophylla. It sometimes gets called the zombie plant. It has a few different other like colloquial names. I think this is the most famous resurrection plant that you will see, but this is a resurrection plant. And as you can see, this is a sped up time lapse, but you can tell that it actually is coming back to a green active state in a matter of just a few hours, and it's unfurling in this very creepy way. So that'll be my introduction into resurrection plants. So let's get into it. What is a resurrection plant? To put resurrection plants in the context of the rest of biology, these would be plants that are among this group of organisms that are described as desiccation tolerant. And desiccation tolerant organisms are able to survive drying to -100 megapascals. And that is a way that we measure something called water potential, which is basically how available is water in the system, in the body of the organism. So dehydration sensitive organisms wouldn't be able to survive much more than, or much less, sorry, than -5 megapascals, whereas There's, pretty large range of dehydration tolerance, and then desiccation tolerance comes down to this very low level of water availability. And you can see that also their cells are making changes to survive this level of water availability. So, what is desiccation tolerance really? So, this is the ability for a organism, and we're going to kind of shift to talking about plants now. So for plants, this is the ability to dry to a quiescent state or a dormant state, basically, and then stay that way for a period of time. So if you're looking at this plant water status versus time figure, this would be, high water availability to low water availability over time. So these plants will dehydrate over time. They will spend a certain amount of time desiccated. And then when water becomes available again, they can rehydrate. And this is the kind of resurrection portion of their life. And then they can resume normal cellular function after being rehydrated. To put this in the context of other plants, we can kind of group plants into three broad categories, which we'll say drought-sensitive plants, drought-tolerant plants, and desiccation-tolerant plants, which then get split into two different broad groups. We'll talk about that later. But basically, a drought-sensitive plant is going to show signs of stress under just mild dehydration stress, and they will not survive moderate stress. Whereas a drought-tolerant plant can survive mild stress quite easily. They will start to show signs of damage under moderate drought stress and will not survive severe drought stress. Whereas our desiccation tolerant plants can survive all of that, and then survive severe stress by going into this state of dormancy, and then recover when water is available again. And I'll just point out that I'm borrowing this lovely figure from this paper that is cited there at the bottom. Okay, so drought survival strategies for plants is kind of a choose your own adventure. So for example, we have here a very drought prone environment. This is a shallow soil depression in a rock here, and there are actually three types of strategies being used by these different plants to survive in this habitat. So those three options are drought escape, drought tolerance, or desiccation tolerance. So plants that utilize drought escape, basically their strategy is to finish their life cycle before the drought gets too bad. This means that they will have fast growth and fast life stages to get into reproduction. They're going to have a really short lifespan or a short growing season, and they survive drought through their seeds. So these are typically annual plants. In Texas, I think good examples are our bluebonnets, our springtime wildflowers tend to be drought escapers where they're going to kind of grow throughout the wet season and then flower and drop their seeds before the really bad drought of summer kicks in, and then they can survive to the next generation through their seeds. Drought tolerators would be the next category. So these would be like the dehydration tolerant plants. So their strategy would be to tolerate drought by maintaining the water status in their leaves and being able to recover from some drought stress. And so these plants have a lot of different strategies to prevent water loss in the first place. They're going to typically have reduced leaf area. So my example of that would be, this is a catclaw acacia. So it has very small leaves that often do get kind of folded up. They kind of try to avoid losing water out of these tiny leaves. Or cactuses also, their leaves are actually the spines are modified leaves, and the stems are the big juicy fleshy parts of the cactus. So that would be a reduced leaf, or leaves will be succulent. So this would be an example of like a succulent plant that's native to Texas. Those plants will also tend to have a waxy outer layer of their surface that's quite thick. and hairy surfaces as well. And this also helps to prevent losing water. These plants also will store water either above or below ground so that they never run out. And they are quite good at stress recovery. And then the last option for surviving severe drought would be desiccation tolerance. And so their strategy is kind of the opposite of the drought tolerators, where their idea is to lose all of the water from their cells and actually protect the tissue from the damage that would occur from losing water. They stay dormant throughout the really dry spells. And then when it rains again, they very quickly resurrect from the dead. So these plants have special mechanisms that they use to protect their cells from the stress of dehydration. They rehydrate quickly, and they can do this process over and over and over again, dehydrating and rehydrating each time it rains. So let's talk origin stories. Where exactly did resurrection come from? And you may think this is like a new innovation, but it's actually something that is quite old. So what happened, what scientists have figured is that actually the first plants ever were aquatic. So plants began in water. Typically, we think of it as this sort of single-celled algae-like organism. And desiccation tolerance is thought to be a way for plants to originally begin to colonize land. So a plant that would be able to dry out and survive for a little bit of dryness and then maybe rehydrate when the tides came back in or when, rain came again, these would be the ones that would survive and be able to proliferate. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of plant taxonomy. So I have now tricked you all into listening to me talk about plant taxonomy, which is a treat for me. So this is my first Halloween reference in this talk, which I have jammed a lot of Halloween stuff in here. So happy Halloween, trick or treat. Now we get to talk about plant taxonomy. So for those of you who haven't had much experience looking at phylogenetic trees, this would be a broad phylogenetic tree of plants. So it's starting here at this node with the common ancestor of all of these lineages. And so we want to think of this time is going horizontally across this, not down. So these are all existing lineages that are alive today, and we think of time going horizontal across this figure. So what scientists have found out, first of all, is that the common ancestor of modern plants was likely a resurrection plant, right? Those ancestral algae that were able to survive drying out, and that those have diversified now over, tons and tons of time, millions of years, millions and millions and millions of years, into these other broad categories of plants that we're going to briefly talk about. So plants are broken up into these categories of non-vascular plants. So these would be plants that don't have vascular tissue, things that like xylem and phloem that, like our veins and arteries, transport water and nutrients around the plant that would allow them to get larger. So things like liverworts, hornworts, and mosses tend to be small and very low to the ground plants. And then later, as plants continued to diversify, we began to see vascular tissue and later lignin, so even more, structured vascular tissue, even more strong lignin would be like what makes wood. So things like club mosses or selaginellas, and then ferns. So those would be vascular plants, but not seed plants. So these plants reproduce by spores, but they do have vascular tissues. And then later, the development was seeds and pollen. So the groups of plants that reproduce by seeds and pollen would be gymnosperms, which are things like pines and cedars, junipers, stuff like that. And then angiosperms, these are plants that have flowers and fruits. And so that was a big innovation for plants. I think most of the time, if you would like imagine a plant in your head as an example of a plant, you'll probably be thinking of an angiosperm or maybe a fern. Okay, let's get a little deeper into taxonomy and phylogeny. Don't freak out. This is more complicated but really it is basically the same tree, but expanded. Um, and so once again, we have this node here showing our ancestral lineage, which was likely an algae-like organism. We have our non-vascular plants, okay? Purple is hornworts, pink is liverworts, red is mosses, and then we have ferns and selaginellas, or ferns and club mosses, right? This little area of the tree is right here. Our gymnosperms, this area is right here, and then flowering plants, angiosperms. And so as you can see, plants kind of went off with angiosperms. Now, what I want you to notice about this tree is that all of these little bits of text represent a plant family. So a plant family would be a group like palm trees or grasses, would be good examples of a family of plants. And each piece, each little text here representing an extant, family of plants that exists today. Each one that's blue means that that family has at least one species that is desiccation tolerant, that is a resurrection plant. So if it's blue, that means that there are resurrection plants within that plant family. Now, if you look at this phylogeny, you can see that most of the concentration of resurrection plants are in these non-vascular plants. There's a few more in ferns. Weird going on here with gymnosperms where there's no representation. And then when you get back to angiosperms, there's just a small handful, and it becomes a lot more rare for a plant family to have any desiccation tolerant lineages, any desiccation tolerant species. And so this has led scientists to come to the conclusion that resurrection ability has been lost by plants as they've become larger and more complex, have more organs and more parts than these smaller, low to the ground plants. And so as plants diverged from their common ancestor, they lost this resurrection ability. Another thing just to touch on is that something we don't actually know for sure, we don't have a good explanation for why this resurrection ability was completely lost in gymnosperms. So like I said, gymnosperms are your pine trees, your spruce, ginkgo, cypress, cycads, things like that. These are actually usually really stress tolerant plants. They tend to they can live in deserts, they could live at very high elevations, but none of these plants are completely desiccation tolerant. So just like an interesting observation, but not, there's no really clear explanation scientifically for why that is. Okay, so how did desiccation tolerance become so widespread across all of these different plant lineages, since we see it in all of these different groups? One explanation for that requires us to kind of take a step back and think about desiccation on this larger scale, where desiccation can actually happen in reproductive tissues or vegetative tissues. So when I talk about a resurrection plant, I'm talking about a plant that's capable of vegetative desiccation tolerance. However, reproductive desiccation tolerance is actually really common in plants. So reproductive tissues would be something like spores, that ferns reproduce by their spores, pollen in flowering plants or in gymnosperms, and in seeds. So spores, pollen, and seeds actually really commonly desiccate. Most of them desiccate and then rehydrate, and that actually helps them have a lot more reproductive success. So they can travel long distances or sit in the soil and wait until conditions are right and then rehydrate, right? However, vegetative desiccation tolerance is the thing that's rare. So vegetative tissue would be the root system, the leaves, the stems. Those things are actually much more difficult. They can't actually recover easily from drying out. And so that's really the thing that's rare, is vegetative desiccation tolerance, whereas reproductive is quite common. So what do we think happened here is that reproductive desiccation is believed to have come from these ancestral genes that were present in all plants. And so that ancestor contained sort of the material and the information to give these plants the ability to dry out their pollen and their spores and their seeds. And then what's happened with modern resurrection plants, so like our angiosperms and ferns and selaginellas, they believe to have been able to recycle some of these genes and some of those pathways that they use to express those genes to be able to achieve that vegetative desiccation tolerance that was actually lost from that ancestor. And then the other question you may ask when we get into genetics is, do resurrection plants use any special types of genes to achieve this desiccation tolerance? And as far as we know, no, not really. So at this point, what we do know about it is that resurrection plants will actually use a lot of the same types of genes as other plants do to combat stress. They regulate them differently, so they will express those genes, use them in different ways and at different times than desiccation sensitive plants. But the other thing that they've done, and that we've found out through genomic research, is that desiccation tolerant plants will actually have more copies of some of the important stress response genes than other types of plants have. So they call this gene duplication. And so basically, if you were to look at this diagram, this represents like a stretch of DNA, and these little chunks on it represent a gene. So this purple chunk represents a stress response gene. So this specifically would be an ELIP, which we're not going to get into what that is. But basically, it is a gene that plants will use to respond to stress. And so a desiccation sensitive plant might have one or two copies of this gene, whereas a desiccation tolerant plant will have made several copies in their genome of that gene. And so the way that genes work is that genes code for proteins. So stress response genes create stress response proteins. And so if you have many, many more stress response genes than another plant, then it's likely to think that you're going to have a higher abundance. You're going to have many more of those stress response proteins as well. And you might be able to regulate them differently as well. So that's what we've got. That's the explanation for that. So now that we know that, let's talk about the mechanisms of resurrection. Like, how do you Frankenstein a plant? And the answer for that is that if you want to wake from the dead, you can't actually die. So how we do that, how we prevent dying when we get to this state where it looks quite dead or looks like it should be quite dead, is to protect cells from two of the main problems that occur when drying out. So problem number one, we're going to call mechanical stress. And so this is how cellular structures begin to collapse and lose their structure without water. And then the second would be chemical stress. And so this is the way that the chemistry inside of the cell depends on water to function properly. Let's start with mechanical stress. So to bring back in my Halloween stuff, but to illustrate mechanical stress, I wanted to use this example of a pumpkin. So when you cut your pumpkin open and make a jack-o'-lantern, you know, what happens a few weeks later? It becomes this. So what's happening here is that, you know, one of the things is that it's decomposing mold, bacteria, whatever. But another reason why this happens is that the pumpkin is losing water. And water does kind of keep all of these things taut and turgid and firm, right? And so as the pumpkin dehydrates, it collapses in on itself and it breaks in these different places as it loses its structure. And so if you were to imagine trying to rehydrate this pumpkin and blow it back up with water, these places where it's collapsed and broken are not going to work well. You know, you're not going to have a sealed outer layer to hold water in anymore, to hold the things inside of it in anymore. So it's kind of the same concept inside of the cell. And so some of the things that plants are doing to protect cells from mechanical stress, this again is another great figure borrowed from a paper, so I did not make this, but I will cite papers at the end. This would be some of the ways that plants, the desiccation tolerant plants, resurrection plants, protect themselves from mechanical stress. And so they will do things like condensing their DNA, they'll protect their cell membrane with special proteins, and they'll actually fold their cell walls in a more organized manner and like a structured way to prevent them from just breaking. They'll also reduce the cell volume and depolymerize their cytoskeleton to sort of allow for this movement. Um, the other thing that they do that I think is quite relevant and interesting is called vitrification of the cell. And so this basically is like preserving the protective cell, kind of like being frozen in time. And the way that they're doing this, and I presented this to the audience at Science Under the Stars, and our very smart audience recognized that these types of molecules are basically sugars. And, photosynthesis produces sugars. Plants have sugars, and we all have sugars that we use for energy. And so what happens when the cells are trying to reduce water loss and reduce the effect of water loss is that they will kind of pump sugars into their cytoplasm, into the, inside of the cell. The interesting thing with desiccation tolerant plants is that they also will produce some of these more complex sugars, like raffinose and trehalose, and these are some of the molecules that help the plants vitrify and become more of like a solid state rather than like a squishy aqueous cytoplasm. Um, and again, on my Halloween theme, I kind of associate this and akin this to like a cellular candy. And since giving this talk, I still haven't tasted my plants, but I have now been thinking about whether or not desiccated leaves would be sweet. So I'll maybe get back to you guys with that information. But yeah, trick or treat, happy Halloween. Cellular candy with the sugars used for cell vitrification. Okay, on to chemical stress. This, I personally believe, is the scariest slide of my talk for me because I have to say these two words out loud. I'll give you a moment to kind of view what we're looking at here. But basically, there's two kinds of resurrection plants. I didn't plan this well. We have Poikio chlorophyllus plants, and those are plants that break down their chloroplasts and are able to rebuild them later after water returns, and Homoeo chlorophyllus plants, and those are the ones that can protect their chloroplasts from sunlight. So why are we talking about chloroplasts? What is a chloroplast again, right? So chloroplasts are the chlorophyll containing organelles inside of a plant that basically are what makes plants green. So they are these complicated little bits of cellular machinery, and they contain chlorophyll pigments, which is what absorbs the sunlight. How does being dry mess that up, you might ask? Well, as we all know, the mitochondria, and I got everyone to say it with me, but you can say it with me from your computer, is the powerhouse of the cell. But what most people don't know is that chloroplasts, when they are devoid of water, without any water, chloroplasts actually become the haunted house of the cell. So what's going on here? Basically, photosynthesis without water is incredibly scary. So what's happening is that chloroplasts use photosynthesis to convert light, carbon dioxide, and water into energy, sugars, and oxygen. What happens is that when there's not enough water in the system, the light absorption, that energy needs to still go somewhere. And so what happens instead is that harmful reactive oxygen species, ROS molecules, are created. And these are incredibly unstable molecules. You may have heard them called free radicals. But yeah, they basically are in the plant just messing things up. So what they do is they're incredibly unstable. And so what they'll do is interact with other molecules, things like proteins, cell membranes, DNA. They put all of those things in danger by interacting with them and kind of breaking them apart or messing up their structures. And so I, of course, used a classic video game reference here to illustrate the point, which is Plants vs. Zombies, where basically in the game, zombies break through your fence and break into your house and destroy all of your stuff, right? And so My zombies here are representing free radicals, and our fence and other things that can be destroyed by the zombies are representing our cells, proteins, and membranes. And then our hero plants that fight back against the zombies and try to keep them back and neutralize them. Those represent our antioxidants. So antioxidant molecules basically interact with the free radical molecules and neutralize them, and they can help protect the things inside of your cell that are in danger. Resurrection plants, as you may guess, produce tons of antioxidants. But instead of producing antioxidants, what might be better is to just prevent this from happening in the first place, right? So kind of like putting on sunscreen to prevent your skin from harmful radiation from the sun. Plants, desiccation tolerant plants, have two different strategies for how they protect their chlorophyll from the harmful radiation that is going to create these free radicals. So to go back to our two types of resurrection plants, we have our Poikilochlorophyllus resurrection plant. And so my example for that, I chose Xerophyta viscosa because it is an absolutely gorgeous plant that there's been some cool research on. So this is one of the Poikilochlorophyllus plants that will break their chlorophyll down into smaller parts. So we've got some photos here. This would be a plant that is completely dried out. And then this is that same plant 5 days later. And so that is kind of the only maybe downside to being a Poikilochlorophyllus, is that it takes them a bit longer to resurrect entirely and go back to being active, because they do need to rebuild these complicated structures. And the other thing is that it takes them a little longer. They need a little bit slower of a dry down as well. So as they're drying, if it happens too rapidly, that can cause a lot of damage for them. Our other option, it would be to be a Homo eochlorophyllus resurrection plant. So these plants will actually protect their chlorophyll instead of breaking it down. And they do this through pigmentation using anthocyanins, carotenoids, and other pigments to kind of turn red or even purple, even black almost, with how much they accumulate. And they'll also fold and roll their leaves up to protect their chlorophyll. So this is a Homo eochlorophyllus plant, Tripogonella spicata. So this is actually my species of interest that I study on my PhD. So kind of my baby. I love this plant. And you can see here, this is a plant that's been drying for a little while, and it's starting to get these little red tips. It's starting to build up some of these pigment molecules, and you can even see it's kind of starting to fold its leaves a bit. And then this is a few days later, after it's gotten a little more dry, and you can see how the leaves have gotten quite dark with pigment, and they've also rolled up. Okay, a little bit of a closer look at the leaf rolling. So what's happening here is to put some context for these photos, this is to call out to the paper, the people who did this cool research. If you were to imagine looking down a blade of black grass, tip to base, and then you chopped that in half, that's this view that you have here, right? So this is like the midline, the edges of the leaves, top of the leaf, bottom of the leaf. Okay, so these two photos at the top are fully hydrated leaves. You can see how happy these little cells are in here. And then at the bottom, same view, but desiccated. So you can see the cells shrinking here, like we talked about the mechanical stress that they do and how they deal with that. But also you can see how they've got this pigment, and they actually built it up down on the lower part of the leaf, the bottom side of the leaf, and they have all of this pigment built up, and then that they've also folded the leaf up so that if the sun's shining down on this leaf from whatever direction, it's not going to get at that chlorophyll. The chlorophyll is all tucked on the inside and completely protected. So pretty cool. So now that we've talked about all of these different mechanisms, it's kind of hard to understand, why don't all plants just do this? If all plants have the genetic blueprint to do this stuff, why can't they all just be desiccation tolerant if need be? I would love that for my houseplants, right? But the problem is that there is a trade-off, right, with everything. There's an ecological or evolutionary trade-off associated with desiccation tolerance. So this lifestyle, doing all of these mechanisms, being ready for stress at all times, this is actually a very high energy cost for that type of lifestyle. So desiccation tolerant plants actually use a lot of energy to do the mechanisms that we talked about. And they also, that leads them to actually being quite slow growers. They also spend a lot of time dormant. So they're quite slow growing and tend to be really small in size. And this makes them weak competitors against other plants. And so all of that leads to them being very highly restricted in their habitat. So they can only live in very specific niche habitats. So the resurrection plant habitat looks a little bit like this. They like to live on igneous rock outcrops. In Texas, that typically means they're on granite. Um, they live on shallow soils, and they actually tend to live in semi-arid climates. So you'll actually find them less often in like a full desert, and clearly that's not a very advantageous lifestyle for someplace that's wet all the time. But they tend to do really well in climates that have that sort of uh, intermittent rains, wet season, dry season type of climate. And so to kind of illustrate that, this shallow soils idea is that these soils dry out very quickly, and that makes it difficult for other plants like the desiccation tolerators or the desiccation or the drought escapers, sorry, drought tolerators and drought escapers have a hard time living in really shallow soils. And so to illustrate this idea, this is some resurrection plant habitat. So we have the rock face here, and then this is shallower soil and then going into deeper soil. So you can see here, these are more of the drought tolerant grasses. And then this little band of grass here is actually Tripogonella spicata. That's that resurrection grass I was talking about. And so this is the really shallow soil that just overlays the rock. And you can see in this perfect little band. And actually, these are some of them that are dried up here. And then there are some here that are green. And so they're really just kind of eking out a living on the edges of these little rock pans where the soil is just too shallow for other plants to make a living there. So yeah, this is another photo taken from the top of Enchanted Rock State Park in Texas. Resurrection plants live in these habitats that are way too hostile for any of their competition. So here's some dried up Tripogonella. You can see also here, these are some of the Selaginella club mosses, and they're also quite dry. What's cool about this is that they also help soil to accumulate in these habitats. And then over time, this allows the soil pans to grow larger and deeper. And then eventually other plants like drought escape and drought tolerant plants can make their homes here as well. And so this is called ecological succession. So a lot of resurrection plants are actually early successional or primary successional species that tend to help make the habitat more uh, more um, more useful for other species. Sorry, I just had the biggest brain drain. Anyway, yeah, so they'll start to set up the habitat for other species to come through and also use that area. Okay. So Texas is a really great place for resurrection plants. Given, the habitat restrictions that we've just talked about. So a couple of my favorite places, public places that you can go and see these plants. I would suggest going to Enchanted Rock State Park or Inks Lake State Park. A few examples. Here are some little Tripogonellas hanging out. And I think this is after a rain and they're beginning to dry. So there's some dry ones and some green ones, and they're also surrounded by Selaginellas, club mosses. So yeah, Central Texas is actually home to the only known desiccation tolerant flowering plant, angiosperm, in the United States. So, right, if you remember back to that phylogenetic tree, we talked about how angiosperms are pretty rare to be resurrection plants. Um, so in the United States, the only angiosperm that you will find is Tripogon spicata, Tripogonella spicata. Its previous name was Tripogon spicatus, so that is what this map is showing, which I borrowed from this paper. So Tripogon spicatus is found throughout South America, throughout Central America. These green dots represent known occurrences. And then there is one green dot representing this area of Central Texas. And within that area of Central Texas, the Llano Uplift area, the only place that you'll find these plants is on granite, right? Like we said, they're restricted to those granite substrates. And so the actual distribution within that green dot that you will find these plants is on igneous rock, right? On the granite. So that's represented on this map by pink. So within the Llano Uplift, you will only really find Tripogonella on rock outcrops or around rock outcrops in these pink areas. And just to re-illustrate, now you can kind of watch this video again with some hopefully renewed wonder and understanding of what this plant had to go through to be able to resurrect these leaves from being so dry. And you can see them beginning to uncurl, how tightly they curl up these leaves to get so skinny. And this time lapse was taken over about 24 hours, I think. So relatively really quick turnaround for this plant to become green again. Yeah, and quite creepy how they're little flower stalks. So these are the flowers of the flowering plant. Grasses do have flowers. They're just not very showy. They're wind pollinated typically. So, but yeah, anyway, okay, so that's our resurrection. It's also called commonly 5-minute grass or Tripogonella spicata. If you've been to those sites, Enchanted Rock or Inks Lake, you've probably stepped right on top of it. So next time you go, maybe you'll recognize her, say hi. I have been studying this plant for quite a few years, and so I know it is just like a diminutive little grass, but I've started to kind of see the beauty in it. So I have a lot of photos of Tripogonella. I had to kind of hold myself back from putting too many in here. But they are really interesting in how they're found, where they will kind of be growing like on those rock edges, like I showed before, or sometimes they will seem to be coming straight out of the rock, or they'll find a tiny crevice in the rock to root into, or they'll be growing on top of a bed of these other desiccation tolerant plants. So this is a Tripogonella grass growing on top of a club moss here. And then what's really nice about being a plant biologist is that my specimens don't run away from me. So I can go out into the field and I can attach a tag to a plant and then come back several weeks later and see how it's doing. So this would be a dried plant that was tagged, and then here's how it looks after the next rain. Okay, and then another thing I wanted to show you is just how interesting and how dynamic it can be when you see them in the wild, given what the hydrology of the area looks like, which areas stay wet or dry. So this is, again, just kind of a nice illustration of how these plants look dry versus hydrated. So here is, again, this is a bed of Selaginella club moss in the rock, and then these little tufts here are Tripogonella grasses. So you can see the green ones here compared to the dried ones. And the way that Selaginellas actually dry up a bit faster, they kind of hold on to their water for a little bit less time than the grasses are able to do, which is another interesting thing. So, okay, let's talk about some more different resurrection plants of Central Texas. Starting with, if we think about, taxonomically, we're going to start with our non-vascular plants. Oh, I didn't think about where my slides were. I'm just going to try to duck under here. Okay, so we have our moss. This would be like a true bryophyte, a true moss versus like a club moss. So the mosses are quite cool. If you find them out in the wild dry, you can try dumping a little bit of your water bottle onto the plant and sit there for a few minutes, and you might see them green up again, which is pretty cool. And then these are liverworts, and liverworts are strange little plants. and they're quite flat, right? And then these are their reproductive structures here. I'm no expert on liverworts, so I don't have a specific species for either of these for you. But if you're happy enough with broadly categorizing plants, definitely go out and try and find yourselves some mosses and liverworts. Our next cool plant. This is Selaginella corallina, pretty common to find out in these habitats as well. It's pretty distinctive. It's the only one that's going to kind of grow up like this with these kind of long fingers, and I guess it was named for the way that it kind of reminded the botanist who named it of coral. So it's the kind of coral looking one. And then the next one would be Selaginella peruviana. This one tends to be a little more cushier and more low to the ground and sprawling, but also just like a quite nice looking plant. If you were to go out around now, which would be, October, some of the driest months, where in Texas right now it's been in the high 90s with no rain for weeks and weeks and weeks. This is what they're going to look like. So these are some dried up. This would be our Selaginella corallina here and Peruviana here, alongside some drought tolerators that are hanging out. Okay, what about the ferns? Everybody loves ferns, right? So let's get into it. This is probably my favorite resurrection plant when I go out into, besides my little grass, when I go out into the field. I really like to see them. I think they're so cute. This is Pellia ovata. They call it a zigzag fern or ovate leaf cliffbrake. The Pellias are the cliffbrake family. Genus, they're not a family. Anyway, you can kind of see how they got their name with this little bit of a zigzag of the way that they arrange their leaves. If you were to find one dry, they might look a little more like this, and you can see them kind of doing this leaf curling thing that resurrection plants tend to like to do. The next Pellia, the other cliff break that you might find out there, is Pellia wrightiana. This would be Wright's cliff break, and it's also pretty easy to recognize the way that the leaves kind of cluster around in these little spirals, kind of. And it's another really, really cute fern, in my opinion. And then the last would be Myrioteris lundheimeri, or woolly lip fern. This one is really common to see. You'll see it a lot at Enchanted Rock. As you go up the rock, you'll see these nice big, big showy bunches of these ferns. So they're really cool. One thing we don't actually know is that are these ferns truly resurrection plants, or are they just very, very drought tolerant? And so hopefully there are some young future scientists that are willing to go in and do some work to figure out the answer to this question. They do have a lot of clues that would lead us to believe that they are desiccation tolerant. They live in the right habitat. They like to do this sort of curling up thing. They are also part of a genus that does have other resurrection tolerant lineages. So that's a good clue that they might also have that ability. So how would we figure that out? So this is an example. It's Alabama lip fern, Myrioteris alabamensis. And what was cool is I was talking to this with a professor at UT, and she happened to have a specimen of this plant at her home and was asking me whether I think it might be a resurrection plant or not, whether it might be a desiccation tolerant fern. And so I thought, well, we do have some clues. Myrioteris is a genus that's known to have desiccation tolerant species within it, and it is living in that semi-arid habitat. And so I told her, if she's willing to risk it, why don't you test it out? So she did take a smaller specimen of that plant that she had, and she let it dry and then watered it a bit later, and it did bring back several of those leaves. So you can see they're quite curled up, not looking very dry, and they did come right back with a bit of sustained damage, but they made it back. So that is some good evidence that this might be a resurrection fern. And that one's actually much closer to Austin. I think you can find ferns like this around like Shoal Creek and along other creeks like that. So interesting plant to look out for next time you're out there. Okay, and I just want to thank really everybody who came out and supported me and listened to my talk the first go around, and anybody who made it this far in the YouTube video. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Science Under the Stars organizers, and specifically the ones who are going to help me stitch this together with the question and answers upcoming. So there will be some question and answers that happened during the talk itself that we'll stitch to the end of this video. Thanks to the UT Integrative Biology Department that funds this organization, this volunteer organization. And yeah, I wanted to shout out some of the papers I borrowed some figures for to help illustrate these topics and share their research with you. So definitely go and check these out if you are interested in learning more about resurrection plants. And yeah, that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
I haven't tasted them either, actually. I don't know if they're actually sweet. I thought about that when I was making the slides, and I might try it.
Nice. I'm just gonna ask what everybody's thinking.
Okay.
Can we apply this to humans?
Oh my gosh, to humans! Man, I don't know. Probably not. There are animals that can do it. So like tardigrades, I think, are the most famous desiccation tolerant animal. I think they were talking about a wood frog over on the slides too that dries out. But I think part of the reason that it works is that most of the organisms that can do this are pretty small. So I think we have to figure out how to shrink humans first, and then maybe. Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions.
Okay.
I don't know which one is more difficult, but you mentioned a lot of times dead and alive.
Yeah.
And with so much technology, basically it depends on how much effort you put on something. There are really dead things that you can become alive, depending on how much effort you put on the lab.
Yes.
So
yeah.
what is that alive? Or how do you say, when do you say something is dead?
When do you say something is dead? This is maybe even a philosophical question.
No. Forget about that. I'm talking about completely scientific. You said resurrection.
So the way that I would say this, at least in plants, is that many plants, right, the tissue. So say you're a native grass that's very drought tolerant, and drought comes through, and this grass doesn't die necessarily, but all of the leaf tissue is senesced. And that same tissue, so the cells themselves that have become dry, cannot become active again. And so in these plants, the cells themselves and the tissue themselves that become dry are active again. But say like a switchgrass, like a native grass or something, they maybe have water storage in their rhizomes, or maybe they drop seeds and a new plant grows next season, but that same tissue that went through the drought stress doesn't come back to life. It doesn't come back to being functional or being active. And so I think it is, if a tissue or a cell goes to the level of stress that it cannot recover itself, maybe it can replicate in some way, right? Or like the organism can stay alive, but the tissue itself coming back is the kind of definition of the resurrection tolerance, or the desiccation tolerance. Should I run around with this mic? I can do that.
Okay, yeah, this one. Well, the second question is, I'm an engineer, and I got about 2 years ago posed a question, is how can trees grow more than 30 feet high? And because from the engineering point of view, you cannot suck that high, and there is no pump on the bottom. The pressure for like a redwood, it would explode if you pump it from the bottom. And you physically, it's impossible to suck it from the top. So how do they do it?
Okay, actually I can tell you that. I do know the answer to that, actually. So like redwood trees, the way that they get water to the top, it's actually because they're living in like a temperate rainforest climate, and it's actually from the fog. So they absorb the water at the very top of their leaves. They absorb water from the top. So what he's saying is that the way that plants bring water into their leaves is this passive process where it's basically sucking water up through a straw by opening their stomata, which does gas exchange, and then the water potential, it draws water up from the bottom, but there's no pump to get the water up. So if you're a very, very tall tree, the actual physics of getting water to the very top of the tallest trees, it actually doesn't work. And so yeah, those trees actually absorb water from the atmosphere and from fog in the mornings, and that's how like sequoias are that tall.
It doesn't go up.
It doesn't go up. Yeah, it goes down, or they kind of, yeah. It goes up as far as it can, and then the rest of it is from the fog. Yeah, cool question.
You said they're all on igneous rock. Why not on limestone?
I have no idea. I don't know. And that's when actually I thought I might get that question. And I kind of panned through the literature, and I've kind of low-key had that question in my mind too, or it's like, why is it, we've got tons of limestone all over the place. And when I was first doing collections and first started my PhD, I would check limestone spots that I thought maybe would have it. And I've never found it there. And I haven't found an explanation. I kind of assume there's maybe something chemical going on or something with nutrition. But I don't know. So that's another future scientist question. Why igneous rock? I don't know.
Is it the same with Southern?
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, that's a global thing that usually you'll find them on igneous rock, like globally. So not just Texas. Okay. Yep. Okay. Wait, keep your hand up because I lost you. Okay.
What's your least favorite type of reviving plant?
Least favorite? No. No, I'm not answering. No. Okay, you know what? No, I don't have one. I'm sorry. I can tell you my most favorite.
Yeah.
It's the grass that I said. What's your least favorite plant that I talked about today? You don't hate any of them? All right, cool. All right, well, we're on the same page about that. Okay, what else? Any other questions? Oh. Chenyi, this really is like running around. Yeah.
It's working. Okay. So with the plants that use the sugars and the ones that like build up anthocyanins, how are they? I'm assuming they break those down after the water comes back, right? So how, if it's like the dry and wet cycle is happening and changing so quickly, are they just really, really good at like building those things up really quickly and like that? Or, okay. And then also one more thing. Like all the cactus in West Texas and like New Mexico, like a bunch of them are purple. I think they use like another one, like not anthocyanins, but like beta something. But it does the same thing, or it's also like shielding the.
Yeah, so cactuses, yeah, other plants will use anthocyanins as a stress response, and they also can be used as like pest response. Like they're used in a lot of different ways in plants, and they're also kind of I think they can do some antioxidant things. Like there's a bunch of different types of anthocyanins and other types of pigments. So yeah, when you see like the buildup red in a cactus, it's kind of just like a plant's way of saying like I am stressed out. Yeah. Okay, awesome.
You showed a slide that had both like a desiccated and a not desiccated, the same plant not desiccated, and what magnification were those images taken at? Yeah. No worries. Can I ask one more question? Okay. And then also you said that one of the ways that they're able to accomplish this tolerance is through an exceptionally large amount of antioxidants that they express. So we talked about antioxidants in our food and how good it is for us to eat. Does that mean that there would be some sort of advantage of eating these plants particularly?
Maybe. Honestly, throughout this talk, I'm becoming more and more tempted to eat some of my plants. I don't know if it's a good thing, but yeah. But no, there is a species. So there's a species called Myrothamnus falabellifolia. It's like the resurrection bush. It's actually one of the few desiccation tolerant plants that are like really large, like maybe up to your knees, but big for a desiccation tolerant plant. But there is a researcher that I speak and I know, and she's working with like a cosmetic company and with this plant and in kind of this idea of like resurrect your skin sort of a thing, and using some of those compounds that are protective, and protecting the cells and trying to keep them from stress. So yeah, I think there is some. I don't know about eating them necessarily. They're probably better antioxidant-rich foods, but there are people looking into it as like a wellness thing. So yeah, it's not unthought of for sure. Yeah. Okay. No, you've had your hand.
In reference to the ferns that you had on the slide, where you were like, we're not really sure if they're drought tolerable or if they're resurrection plants, would you be able to test that by like putting them in a drought, or are there other like factors that would have to go into deciding if they're a resurrection?
No, yeah, basically the way you test it is you put them in a drought, and you kind of have to do it in a controlled way where you know what the relative humidity and what the internal water potential of the plant is, and then rehydrating them and kind of being able to record that in like a scientific way. And I have been trying to do it, but it was always a side project, and so I just kept falling off, and I haven't been able to do it. And then I ditched the part of my dissertation that's about ferns. So I'm not going to do it in my PhD, but maybe later in my career. But yeah, so there are ways that people, there are established methods to testing that. And you could just test it in the lab, or, kind of what Amy did with her ferns on the last slide, test it at home. So just get an idea here.
How does one grow a resurrection fern?
I have not been able to keep them alive in the lab very well, so I don't know. I don't know. But I think, are we at a time cutoff, or how are we doing?
No, you're good.
I'm good? Okay, I guess we're good. Is there any more questions? There's more questions. There's questions everywhere. Oh, okay. Let's go here first, and then I'll come back. Yes.
Is there something you could put in a resurrection plant or in the soil to stop it from resurrecting?
Not that I know of. Are you? Yeah. I don't know. I don't think so. They don't like pests. I've definitely been able to kill them in the greenhouse. They're not unkillable. Yeah. Do you have enough? Are you? Okay, cool. Yeah. No, I haven't been able to stop them, but I have been able to kill them by accident. Okay.
Does fire kill resurrection plants?
Actually, so I think that they are fire adapted. One of the sites that I did field work at, they had a burn location where they were doing prescribed burns, and so the leaves obviously burn away, but the roots do seem to tolerate the heat, and they do resprout from the same crown. So they are fire resistant, like a lot of other native plants in Texas. Yeah, good question. They're really multi-stress resistant, actually. A lot of them are kind of salt tolerant. These ones are also freeze tolerant. So yeah, they're very good at stress.
Several plants in Texas will have a big form, a big thick root, but some other ones are real small roots.
Yeah.
What are these guys?
These have tiny little roots, really thin thread. I actually was talking to another plant biologist before my talk, and I took one of the ones in the pots. She was asking the same question. I ripped it open. So there's one that's pulled apart if you want to look over on the table. But yeah, they don't have a big rhizome or like a below ground water storage of any kind, they don't waste any time with it because they say, whatever, I don't care, I can dry out. So, yeah. You guys have really good questions. Okay, yeah.
Is desiccated like the default state of them? Or like what triggers them to start to build those like proteins and stuff?
Oh yeah, okay, so their default state is preparing for stress. So that's kind of one of the things where it's like a high energy lifestyle, right? They have to make all these proteins and be kind of ready for stress when it comes. So they are both primed for stress, and then once stress happens, they also start making more chemicals and start kind of systematically planning and then they keep their water, so it's like the soil will dry out, and they will kind of maintain water until they're ready, and then it just kind of like, if you pick their hydration level, it'll like go down, and then it just falls off a cliff, and they're like, okay, I'm ready to dry out, I'm dry. Question. So their default state, they would prefer to be wet and being a plant, but then they're also always ready to dry out. Yeah, and then actually the Poichiochlorophyllus, the ones that have to break their chlorophyll down, they're a lot more sensitive to drying quickly. So they actually need more time to like dry down. If you tried to like really quickly dry them out, it might kill them. Cool. Oh, one more, okay.
They might prefer.
With these like resurrection plants, could you take a plant that doesn't really have like any ability to resurrect and activate the resurrection genes within it to like get a like resurrection plant?
That is such a good question. I'm so glad you asked that. Okay, so that is kind of that would be really difficult because again, like we were talking about the trade-offs and stuff, so most plants aren't really primed to do this. But one of the focuses of resurrection tolerance research or desiccation tolerance research in plants is to try to understand which genes are being used, what mechanisms, what physiology in the cells, and to try to apply that to crops, to allow crop plants to maybe, I think it's a little high in the sky to think we could make a resurrection crop plant, but we could maybe use some of these strategies and the types of genes they use to make plants more resilient to stress. And there have been experiments done where they've taken a gene version from a resurrection plant and put it in like a potato, and that potato survived stress better. It wouldn't be a resurrection plant, but it was more tolerant to drought stress. So yeah, that is a direction. Great question. That is a direction that plant biology is going. So cool. All right.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Allie. And those are some wonderful questions. Yeah. Our next event is going to be November 13th about biological sex of fish. And our presenter is Savvy, who's actually been a volunteer with SUDS for a long time. And Savvy was helping with live streaming YouTube as well. So please make sure you come in November to support Savvy and learn a little bit about their research.
The title slide. Wait, I'm going back so far. I meant to shout you out, but I forgot. Almost there. Savvy's slides are going to be so cool.
All right, so if you want to see some resurrection plants, they are actually right on the table. Allie brought them over, and we also